queer spirituality, because being queer is a spiritual path, with your host, Carly Phillips. Welcome back to the Sapphic and Spiritual Podcast. I'm your host, Carly Phillips, and today we're exploring the concept of the divine feminine and divine masculine. So I am really excited for today's episode because this topic was actually what inspired me to start this podcast in the first place. So I was listening to another spiritual podcast months ago, and they were discussing the concept of the divine feminine and divine masculine, which, side note, if you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, that's okay. We will get into that. That's the entire point of today's episode, so hang tight just a moment. But on this podcast, they were discussing this idea of balancing the divine feminine and divine masculine, which gets thrown around a lot in New Age spirituality these days. And they were talking about it from a lens of traditional gender constructs, talking about the concept very literally and being like, all right, ladies, embody these energies so you can attract your man. And this was on a podcast of someone who I do respect, and I believe they're doing good work in the world, which goes back to the importance of always taking what resonates with you and leaving behind what doesn't when we're talking about spirituality. Same thing goes on this podcast, take what feels right, leave what doesn't. And I get it. As queer women, we are the minority audience, but come on. This was not the first time I've heard the divine feminine and divine masculine presented in this way, through a context of cisgendered woman holds the key to the divine feminine, while a cis man embodies the divine masculine. And then to have this perfect union of the two energies, you need to have the opposite gendered partner, and then boom, you're whole. This is problematic, and it's missing the mark of what spirituality, in my opinion, should be embracing, which is diversity, inclusion, everyone walking on their own unique path. So I'm calling out the spiritual community for this. Whether or not it's intentional, it continues to reinforce and perpetuate heteronormative ideology. If you want to dismantle patriarchy, part of that is also no longer subscribing to heteronormative ideas about how relationships work and how gender works on top of that. Hear me out, spiritual community. Continuing a narrative that divine masculine and divine feminine represent a cis male and a cis female union, you are leaving out queer people, and you are making us feel as if we don't belong in your space. And if that's intentional, then great. Thanks for revealing your true motives and keeping us away from that shit. But honestly, I do believe that for most people within the spiritual community, it's not the intention. It's just so far removed from the straight, cisgendered brain that the idea that they could be making queer people feel like they don't belong in spiritual spaces, I really don't think it crosses their mind. Queer or not, though, I do always find it disempowering for women to be fed any rhetoric that says finding harmony involves any external sources. Like, no, balance and harmony and wholeness, they've got to come first from within. So straight women, if there's any straight women listening, don't buy into what they're selling you, that you need this divine masculine energy that is externally sourced outside of you to feel whole. No, to feel whole, you need to source that from within you and only within you first. By first balancing those energies within yourself, that's how you attract those qualities within someone else. So honestly, if I was not someone who minored in anthropology in undergrad and who has spent years researching all things spirituality, as an autistic woman with a special interest in spirituality, and then there's the whole psychic component too. So I guess if I wasn't me, if I was someone else entirely, I would hear the words divine feminine and divine masculine and think, well, that sounds like a cult. And interestingly enough, this concept has been used in cults. So Netflix and Amazon Prime both released documentaries in 2023 on the twin flame universe cults. Escaping Twin Flame is what it was called on Netflix, and on Amazon it was called Desperately Seeking Soulmate. If you haven't watched them and you love a good cult documentary, check it out. Really fascinating and eye-opening and heartbreaking. It's about this husband and wife duo that ran this cult based on marketing off people's desire to find their soulmates through this concept of twin flames, which is an entirely different subject that we're not talking about today. But it's so they took the idea of divine feminine and divine masculine and modified it to indoctrinate people into their cult, as this idea that everyone is either a divine masculine or a divine feminine, and your twin flame, who's basically your one true fated soulmate, has to be the opposite. So they sold their followers on this idea that they had the power to identify who someone's twin flame was. And in order to keep their businesses profitable and for them to seem credible, that they truly had these divinely orchestrated matchmaker abilities, they had to have success stories of people from within their community that were successfully matched. But the issue was that there were substantially more women than men within their following, so they decided to convince some of their followers who identified as straight cis females that they were actually carriers of the divine masculine. And so as a result, their perfect twin flame match was actually a woman, because they needed to match with someone who embodied the opposite of them, the feminine. So they encouraged these women to transition to men to uphold heteronormative beliefs about having one masculine partner and one feminine partner. So like get this, right? Basically the idea that trans people are in a cult trying to indoctrinate other people into their big trans cult that we hear going around. Well, the actual people doing this, ironically enough, as always, are the cis straight cult leaders attempting to force heterosexual women to transition just to uphold heteronormative roles within queer relationships that are completely fabricated, on behalf of them being able to sell their soulmate membership course or something like that. This makes my brain hurt. Anyway, the divine feminine and masculine have been significantly misrepresented. So we've been talking about what it's not, how it's harmful to queer people when taken literally, how it's been used to spread cult propaganda. So what is it actually? Just like most concepts within spirituality, the divine feminine and divine masculine are energies. They aren't tangible. My personal belief is that pretty much everything is energy. So when I talk about the goddesses, for example, was Aphrodite a real person who lived and walked the earth? Probably not, But I do believe that there's this energy of Aphrodite, these qualities of love, beauty, pleasure that she embodies, and that those energies are real. And we can call on different goddesses who embody different energies, who've walked different paths as sort of role models, as archetypes for us to embody and to lean into when we need them. These energies are accessible to all of us regardless of our gender. Where we miss the mark with spirituality and big time within religion is when we try to take these concepts that are completely esoteric and abstract and we try to fit them into these narrow definitions that fall in line with how humans experience reality. Despite us as humans operating within polarity, seeing everything as black and white, the universe doesn't operate under those rules. So the divine feminine and divine masculine are energies that we all have within us. And when balanced, they help us to obtain a sense of peace and harmony within ourselves. These energies work together and they're complementary to one another. But when they're unbalanced or unhealed, they can create some toxic energies and create dysfunction in our lives. Again, if I haven't said it enough, it has nothing to do with physical appearance or anatomy. These are purely qualities or characteristics. And we'll go more in depth about what those are here in a bit. This concept of divine masculine and divine feminine is linked to the energies of yin and yang. which if you're a millennial like me, do you remember the yin yang signs that seemed to be everywhere when we were kids? It was represented by a circle symmetrically divided into these two halves, and one half of the circle was black with a small white dot, and the other half was white with a small black dot. Anyway, this idea of yin and yang, it stems from various schools of Chinese philosophy. I want to talk more about yin and yang, and I'm referencing an article written by Kendra Cherry on Very Well Mind. I'll link it in the show notes if you're interested. I'm going to read a section of it here. Sherry writes, "These forces are complementary and present in all phenomena. In some situations, one force might be more dominant. However, this balance may shift depending on what is needed at the given moment." So yin is characterized as negative, passive, and feminine. It represents the energy of the earth and the moon, and it's often described as receptive, dark, cool, soft, still, and contemplative. Yang, on the other hand, is portrayed as positive, active, and masculine. It represents the energy of the sun. It is often described as energetic, expansive, and warm. And then she adds this important disclaimer. She says, "It is important to remember that while the yin and yang are opposite of one another, it does not mean they are oppositional or in conflict. Instead, they can be thought of as balancing energies that complement one another. While these forces oppose one another, they coexist in harmony. They are both equal and dependent upon one another. The constant state of flux between these forces helps create balance, which can benefit individuals, societies, and cultures." So let's go back to yin, the feminine energy, for a moment. Yin is described as negative, but it isn't negative in the sense of it being bad. Think of it as a cell nucleus, right? So the yin is the electron, and the yang, or the positive masculine element, is the proton. You need both the positive charge and the negative charge, and it has nothing to do with it being, related to morality or anything like that. It's just part of the nucleus. So we see from the philosophy of yin and yang that opposing forces exist in all areas of life, from the nucleus of a cell to the essence of a human. This is a philosophy based on the idea that balance can lead to maintaining a peaceful and stable state of being. So going back to the Very Well Mind article for a moment, they also talk about yin and yang being elements of dialecticism, which are a set of philosophical beliefs that are based on the premise that all elements have opposing forces, and this is rooted from 3 philosophical principles. Number 1, the principle of change. The principle of change says that reality is always in a state of flux, meaning that something can shift from positive to negative depending on the demands of reality at any given moment. Number 2, the principle of contradiction. This idea suggests that everything in the universe is composed of opposing, simultaneously existing elements. And finally, number 3, the principle of holism, which states that all things are connected, that nothing exists in isolation, and because all things are interrelated, things cannot be understood without looking at the entire interconnected web of experiences, people, and events. So from the lens of yin and yang, when we move away from heteronormativity and this kind of patriarchal rebranding, if you will, of the divine masculine and feminine, we actually see a really strong show of support for queerness within this philosophy. The principle of change says that all life is fluid, meaning gender is fluid, sexuality can be fluid. The principle of contradiction shows us that we can embody both masculine and feminine qualities, and despite them being on complete opposite ends of the spectrum, they actually are quite complementary and want to work together to create balance within us. And then if we look at the principle of holism that says nothing exists in isolation, that we have to consider the unique lived experiences of everyone and everything, and somehow it creates this messy web of interconnectedness that is so grand and it's so abstract that it goes beyond human understanding. So in my opinion, at the end of the day, yin and yang, masculine and feminine, I'd say these ideologies are actually very aligned with queerness and quite the opposite of heteronormative beliefs that say it's either this or that, because it's truly about the in-betweens. So when we look at the divine feminine and divine masculine, we can think of it in terms of yin and yang if we'd like. Just as dialecticism speaks to the complexity of yin and yang, when we talk about the divine feminine and divine masculine, we can't have the divine presentation of these energies without the not so divine or the wounded aspects of them. So the way I like to think about this is visualizing a quadrant, 4/4 of a circle, right? And within this quadrant, you have the divine or healed energies, and then you have the toxic or wounded energies. And remember, we said these energies can help create balance, but when they're out of balance, they can create chaos. So now we're going to dive deeper into what each of the 4 presentations of these energies look like, starting with the divine or healed aspects. And if you're interested, I've created a worksheet that helps you reflect and identify any imbalances within these energies that you might have. So I'll put a link in the show notes, and you can also check it out on my website for free at sapphicanspiritual.com. Okay, so let's start with the feminine. What are the characteristics of the divine feminine energy? Well, the divine feminine energy is the receptive portion. So it's all about being and receiving. It's associated with the following characteristics: creativity, compassion, nurturance, emotions, intuition, wisdom, and flow. And when the feminine energy is out of balance or unhealed, it shows up differently. It can look like insecurity, self-doubt, disassociation, lack of boundaries, people-pleasing, and feeling disconnected from life. So on the contrast, the masculine energy in its divine or healed presentation, it's all about giving and action. It's linked to qualities like protection, assertiveness, being goal-oriented, logic, determination, and being supportive. But the unhealed or the wounded masculine shows up as aggression. It's ego-driven, controlling, defensive, dominating, closed off, selfish, and judgmental. I want to break these down and provide some practical examples of how these energies manifest individually, within relationships, and also within the world, within the collective. So when I think about how these energies have shown up in my life, what's really interesting and what further reiterates the point that this is not about gender at all is that when I was in the closet, outwardly, I appeared what society would consider to be very feminine presenting. And yet my internal operating system was trying to run solely on divine masculine energies. And actually, as I'm talking about this now, and I'm looking at the worksheet I created that's on my website, I'm noticing that when I tried to center my life on divine masculine energies alone, it really brought out the wounded feminine and masculine parts. Like they were super heightened because I was focusing all of my conscious energy on the divine masculine. So the more I feel into this, it really does feel like if we ignore one of these energies without even recognizing it, we get the shadow sides of the energies because we're kind of tipping the scale and we're unbalanced. So let me explain what I mean by all of this. When I was in the closet, I was not only denouncing my sexuality, but I was also the masking queen. I was covering up my undiagnosed autism and was in the spiritual closet as well. So the rule book that I created for myself as an autistic woman, the way that I measured my worth in the world was built on a foundation of values and ways of being that were society approved, not Carly approved. Because I believed being me was a threat to my livelihood. When we think about the types of values that are acceptable or deemed as superior within society, looking at the divine masculine and feminine traits, masculine traits in general are what society endorses. So the divine masculine principle of being goal-focused and logical, we as a patriarchal society, we place more value on those traits than we do the feminine traits of creativity and using our emotions to guide us and living intuitively. I believed my emotions were the bane of my existence. After all, my emotions, what I intuitively knew about myself, they were what I was most scared of. I didn't see them as these divine gifts that were helping me intuitively understand my needs on a deeper level, or as this like signal and center within me, gauging if things were actually in alignment for me. No, I thought my emotions were just crazy making annoyances that created havoc in my life and made me weird. So by pushing all of those divine feminine qualities to the side and only placing value on the divine masculine energies, I became a cocktail of dysfunction, of all of the toxic or wounded aspects of these energies. So in order to mask, I had to completely close myself off from my intuition. And what's interesting is both the wounded feminine and wounded masculine present as being disconnected from life and being closed off. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because we're operating from the wounded parts. We're essentially cutting off the flow of energy, of life force energy. And by doing so, we are just disassociating from life. So closeted, unhealed, masked me was a complete control freak. I had to make sure I had control over every area of my life. One, because I couldn't handle the unexpected or the unknown. And two, because if I presented to the world as being in control, they couldn't see the sides of me I was working so hard to hide. And then the defensiveness comes in, where God forbid someone points something out about you that you don't want them to see. Well, then the fear of being exposed kicks in, and then you're defensive. And the judgmental piece of the wounded masculine, that was so me. I was constantly judging myself, constantly critiquing every move, and if it wasn't perfect, well, that meant I was just a terrible and completely fucked up person. And I see so many characteristics actually associated with my eating disorder that completely took over my life in my teenage years. I see the wounded masculine represented there as well. But I also displayed a lot of wounded feminine characteristics. I was deeply insecure. I was constantly doubting myself because I didn't know who I was. When you're so heavily masked, it's this odd feeling of what's real? Who am I really? Like, am I the mask or am I what's underneath that mask? And if I'm what's underneath the mask, who the fuck is that? So when I abandoned my intuition, I was a complete people pleaser. It was like, needs? What needs? I don't have any needs. How can I serve you? When I was in my 20s, I was engaged to a man that I was in a long-term relationship with. And that version of me, when I look back at her, she was a complete robot. I had no boundaries. My entire world revolved around meeting the needs of my partner and playing out this fantasy role of like perfect little housewife and being overly accommodating and overly bubbly. And it was because I wanted so badly to be perceived as good and normal and to fit in for once. And I was absolutely miserable. And then that's where the divine feminine characteristics of being compassionate and nurturing can actually fail us when they go unbalanced and unchecked. Because ultimately, those are really the only two qualities of the divine feminine that society deems acceptable. Society wants us as women to be sweet and kind and nurturing, but the other traits that go along with the divine feminine, well, we can't be too creative because then we might just learn to think for ourselves or create a life that doesn't look like everyone else's. And we can't be too emotional because then we're crazy. Then it's hysteria. And we can't just go with the flow because we have to be productive and constantly working because capitalism. And there's no way we should trust our intuition because that might lead us down a path that doesn't align with patriarchal values. And wisdom? Well, can women be wise in our culture? Not really. Society tells us that men have the wisdom. The Christian God is a man, and therefore men are wise, women are to follow. So much of divine feminine characteristics are actually intentionally left out of society and not valued. And I do recognize I'm talking about gender specifics here, about women. But I'm speaking more so to how these energies impact women, not assigning the energies to a gender. And the truth is, a lack of the feminine or too much of the masculine or any unbalanced equation of the two of these, they hurt men too. Back when I was a therapist and had my private practice, many of the adult men I saw were really struggling with the lack of understanding their emotions. They rationally, again, a divine masculine trait, they rationally and logically could understand the why behind why it was important for them to get in touch with their emotions. But they had been taught all their lives that boys don't cry and men are tough. And then they somehow found themselves usually having issues within their marriage is what typically led them to therapy. And they felt like they were so cut off from their emotions and intuition that it really did them a massive disservice to them in their lives. If you listened to the witch episode on the podcast last week, we talked about the witch wound. Well, this goes hand in hand with the witch wound. When patriarchy tries to erase the feminine, we're left with the wounded masculine. And remember, the wounded masculine looks like aggression, being ego-driven, dominating, judgmental. Sound familiar? I mean, doesn't that sound a lot like our so-called political leaders right now? Doesn't it seem like a lot of the issues that we have collectively within society can be traced back to those qualities? When we silence the feminine, when we try to erase those energies within society, when we shame them and shun them, we are left with a world that is running off of a wounded masculine energy. And that is a world where war, bigotry, greed, they run rampant. So these unbalanced masculine and feminine energies, they have tremendous societal and collective implications. When we were talking about the yin and yang article, I read a quote from that article that said, the constant state of flux between these forces helps create a balance which can benefit individuals, societies, and culture. What we're seeing before our very eyes is a society that lacks this balance. It's out of flow. If we want to look at the origin of where these energies start getting out of balance for us, we can absolutely look to society as a major player in this equation. When patriarchy says only masculine qualities are worthy of leadership roles and being valued, when gender is black and white, when heteronormativity is the only option presented to us, when capitalism prevails, pushing productivity above all else and cuts us off from our natural state of flow, well, we're left with an unbalanced society. It's evident that there is a serious lack of divine feminine energy when a genocide is occurring in Gaza and our leaders, and even those who aren't leaders, even just regular people, we can see what's happening, witness it, and not have compassion. That's a lack of feminine energy. That's toxic masculine energy at its core. And I don't want to only talk about the masculine energies being toxic, because too much feminine energy without masculine energy also isn't healthy. And here's an example of how this showed up in my life. So I spent the last year in autistic burnout, trying to come out of it. So incredibly long story short, I spent most of my life unaware that I had autism and was heavily masked. I experienced basically consistent trauma from the time of my birth, from being abandoned by both of my parents, domestic violence and psychological abuse in my childhood. Then I had an eating disorder that almost killed me as a teen, and that resulted in me dropping out of high school because I was also in autistic burnout at that time and couldn't make it to school, and no one picked up on why. So I was sent away to treatment centers and labeled as the problem kid. And I was battling that while also battling being gay and trying to hide that. And I experienced such shame from all of that I decided to kind of go all in, if you will, on being what I thought society perceived as perfect. And then I experienced sexual abuse, 2 incredibly toxic relationships with men, financial issues, and all of this somehow while operating my own therapy business and holding it all together to the outside world. So then I finally come to terms with my sexuality, meet my now wife, things are going great. And then a month after coming out and thinking life was finally getting good, my town got wiped by Hurricane Ian. And I was severely traumatized through that. And that was like it. I just could not take any more trauma after that. And my body immediately went into burnout. So again, long story short, when I went into burnout, I realized that what got me to burnout, it wasn't going to get me out of it. And I'm still waiting for the fog of it to be completely lifted. It's heavy and it's dense. But with that recognition of what got me here is not going to get me out of here, came an understanding of how operating from only the masculine parts of my energy field and not embracing flow, not honoring stillness and the inherent worth that we all have just by being and existing, by not following a creative path that lights me up, I started to see the masculine energy as the enemy for me. So first, let me just say that breaking out of the rut of constant productivity and only listening to logic, that took me almost a year to really make any progress with. I still find myself like, okay, Carly, you don't have to be productive right now. You can just be. I have to like literally give myself permission to just be and not be productive. But anyway, throwing the masculine energies out the window and focusing only on the feminine, it was great for a while until I started to feel stagnant. I was creating all of these things and living so deeply within my emotions, which was beautiful, but I got to a point where it was like, okay, I hear the guidance. I hear my intuition telling me, make this podcast, for example. And in order to make this podcast, I need to do something. There needs to be action. I need structure. I need to take actionable steps. And so I feel like in my own life, I see the balancing of these energies as coming together to form this creator energy. It's a perfect equation of being and doing, of giving and receiving. And from that homeostasis point, we can then move on to create a life that's really aligned with our truth. The life that I created before burnout that lacked the feminine intuition and wisdom and trusting my guidance, was that a life? Yes, from the outside looking in, it seemed successful because it was based off of these masculine principles of achievement and determination. But when we lack the why and the motivation for why we're going after what we are, why we're chasing these dreams, we're building our house on a foundation that isn't solid. And it will eventually fall to the ground. My life is a perfect example of that. I needed my intuition. I needed my inner wisdom to guide me to get clarity on what the vision actually was. And that comes from a state of stillness, of just being, of receiving. And then the divine masculine energy comes in to actually follow through with the vision. It builds it. It's like the feminine is the architect and the masculine is the builder. One of the things that I love about being queer and being married to a woman is that we don't operate under traditional gender roles. When you interpret the masculine and feminine energies with traditional gender roles, it's a faulty sense of balance because the balance isn't coming from within, and traditional gender roles aren't based off of equality or equal division of work. So for my wife and I find it really beautiful to see how we balance these energies individually and then also within our relationship. It's truly a give and take, right? So one of us is in the giving role and the other is in the receiving role, and that changes dependent on the circumstances. But it all starts from within first. So for example, if I'm having a low energy day, if the burnout is bad, maybe there's been a lot of demands and I'm experiencing sensory overload, I can use my feminine energy to tune into my body and my wisdom. And then I use my masculine energy of assertiveness to ask Kelly for help. And then she might operate from a divine masculine element of support and logic to help me identify ways to regulate. But she's also using her divine feminine energy of compassion and nurturance to deliver suggestions and support in a way that's empathetic. A lot of it for us, it's about knowing our strengths too, and having the insight into which of these qualities are available to us at any given moment. Is it in our capacity, right? So Kelly is the most patient person I have ever met. And she is like so comfortable with stillness. She is the queen of cozy and is just content with being. It brings her so much joy. And I'm the opposite. I can't sit still. I always have a million projects going at once, and I need to create these like super complex systems before I do anything. So just Kelly's natural feminine energy of being able to just be and to create without attachment to the outcome of it and to flow, well, just being in her presence has helped me tremendously to start to embody that myself. It was like seeing her embrace these divine feminine qualities. It felt like it gave me permission to do the same. And I think that's such a beautiful thing about queer relationships, that we don't have any of these traditional gender roles governing how we operate. And to be fair, I'm not saying that all straight couples abide by traditional gender roles. What I am saying is that there was this sense of freedom that almost seemed scary at first in our relationship because there wasn't a rule book. Look, I'm autistic, so I like to know what's expected of me. And that's how I navigated relationships with men. So by not having that hanging over your head in queer relationships and getting to define that for yourself and exploring how you wish to embody those energies without a societal guide telling you how you should do it, it's actually been really healing. And Kelly and I both have grown a lot through kind of unpacking these energies individually and as a couple. So how do we balance these energies? Well, let's say you've listened to the podcast and you've realized maybe you're lacking in feminine energy, for example. Here's some tips that have helped me and maybe they'll help you. So if you feel like you need to incorporate more feminine energy into your life, get out of your mind and get into your feelings and into your body. This is the energy of being and receiving and of creating. So get creative. If you tell yourself you're not creative, that is a lie and a big sign that you could use some more feminine energy in your life. Everybody is creative. There is no such thing as good or bad art. There's just art. And this is for you. It's not for anyone else. You're not trying to become a world-class painter. You're just trying to create. So if you get stuck about this, think about what you enjoyed doing as a kid. Call on your inner child to kind of guide you in this process. Paint, dance, write, color, whatever it might be, just create something, cook, right? Whatever it is. And another way to increase the feminine is to spend time in nature. So nature is a really perfect role model for us of the feminine energy. Nature's always in a state of flow and really is the embodiment of creation. So get outside in nature, go ground on the earth, just simply be there in nature without any expectations of how it should go or what you should be doing. And to add more to that, maybe you even black out a portion of time during the week that is your feminine energy time, and you set zero expectations for what you should do. Even if you use that time to just take a nap, you're practicing getting in touch with your intuition, and that's what feminine energy is all about. So sometimes we really need to get in touch with our intuition before we even create. So if you're struggling creatively, take a step back and just practice tuning into what it is that you truly want to do and go with that. It doesn't have to be some huge, profound thing. Maybe what your soul really wants you to do is rest, or maybe watch a childhood movie that makes you feel nostalgic and laugh, right? Nurture yourself. That's another way to embrace more feminine energy in your life. Take a bath, eat your favorite food, read a book that nourishes your soul, call your best friend and talk about what's going on with your life. Nourish yourself, nurture yourself. And lastly, don't suppress your emotions. When emotions pop up, start practicing not labeling them as good or bad. The ones that feel annoying or painful, remember that those deserve the same amount of love as the ones that feel positive or exciting. A simple acknowledgement of, oh, I notice my heart is beating really fast right now. I think maybe that means I'm anxious. That in itself, that recognition, that helps you to start developing a relationship with your feelings again. And if you're feeling like you need to bring more divine masculine energy into your life, remember that this is the energy of doing. When we have a lack of masculine energy, we can feel stagnant and like we're not really getting anywhere. So balancing this energy and calling in more of that, it's going to involve action. So maybe you spend some time journaling about ways to meet whatever goal it might be that you have and logically create steps to make that vision become a reality. And then maybe you commit to doing one small action each day to actually achieve that goal. The masculine energy is naturally supportive of the feminine, and again, it's all about doing and giving. So giving back is a great way to get in touch with your divine masculine energy. Maybe there's a cause that you really want to get involved in, and you go volunteer your time with that cause. Also, assertiveness and determination are components of the divine masculine. So one way to call in more of the divine masculine energy is setting boundaries, taking the necessary steps to guard your peace. Maybe you work on your confidence because confidence plays a huge role in our assertiveness and determination. And yeah, working on your confidence can be pretty broad. So maybe it involves committing to daily affirmations about your self-worth and confidence. Maybe it's taking that kickboxing class you've always wanted to take to feel stronger and more confident. What does it look like for you? These are just some suggestions, so I highly recommend taking some time to reflect on the areas in your life that lack some balance and identify some ways to incorporate more feminine or more masculine energy into those areas based on your own life. All right, everybody, so that's all I have for us today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.